Welcome to Pondering Play and Therapy,
where we set out to explore the importance of play in our everyday lives and how this can also be therapeutic. We'll be discussing our own experiences in the hope that others may ponder play in their own lives too.
Welcome to this week's episode of Pondering Play and Therapy with me, Philippa. And this week, my guest is Colby Pearce. And he is a clinical psychologist who lives and works in Ghana, Ninjara, New Rugana, a new country in the land known as Australia. Across the last 30 years, Colby has worked continuously with children and young people recovering from a tough start to life, and adults who interact with them in care and professional roles. He maintains 3 busy psychotherapy clinics, but also finds time to write and deliver programs intended to enhance awareness of the experience, needs, and therapeutic care of young people who have experienced complex childhood trauma, including in Ireland. Colby also works with individuals and teams who support the stabilisation of kinship care arrangements, transition from and post-guardianship care, and family reunification. Colby is also looking to expand his work with individuals and teams working in child welfare and write more. And Colby's also written several books, which when we put the bio up, we'll add some links to at the end. So, Colby, I think I probably did a really poor job at the pronunciation of some of those places. So maybe you could help me and then tell me where they actually are.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Philippa, and thank you for having me on. I think they're a bit like Irish and perhaps some other languages around the world where the way it's spelt often doesn't have much relationship with how it's pronounced. So I apologise. I set you a little bit of a task there. So they are the names of the Aboriginal communities that resided in the various places in which I live and work. So they're the traditional owners or custodians of those lands. So the people of the Ghana people lived primarily around Adelaide, which is where I live here in South Australia. I have a weekend place that I go to, the Murray River. It's a bit over an hour away, and that's the ancestral lands of the Ngarrindjeri people. And I do regional clinics on Narungga and Nukunu land. We acknowledge these lands in respect of the fact that the Aboriginal people have resided on these lands for millennia prior to white settlement.
Okay. And when we think about Australia, it's vast compared to the UK. And are you in the south, the north, the east, the west? Where are these areas?
I'm in the middle at the bottom, so to speak. So South Australia is like the middle section of Australia, and Adelaide is on the coast, or probably a third of the way across from the east. And we had the distinction of being the driest state on the driest continent on Earth. We're in the midst of a heat wave, or a heat wave is really building at the moment. We've got a cyclone up in Queensland, which is a couple of days' drive away. And we've got highly elevated temperatures. Although I often say people wonder about the weather here and how hot it is and how we cope. And I would say that I would prefer 35 degrees Celsius here to high 20s to 30 in the UK, because it's dry here, much more bearable. The closeness in the UK, the humidity, I can't stand that.
No, yeah.
Yeah, but I live in a very dry place.
Okay. And is that where Neighbours comes from, Adelaide? No?
Melbourne.
Oh, okay. I haven't watched that for a long time. Okay.
I don't want people to get the wrong idea, but I'd have watched a few episodes right at the start when I was young.
Okay. And when I read that out, it said you also do some work in Ireland. So
I have done, yep.
How did that come about?
Largely through, I guess, my writing. And so there was a trainer in Ireland who picked up some of my stuff and interacted with me and interacted with the local Tusla fostering service. And out of that became initially a 3-year project to roll out one of my programs to all foster cares. This was in Donegal, in County Donegal in Northwest Ireland. And this year is the 10th year of the rollout. But I used to go over and assist largely with the staff training. We would do a yearly staff training in the Tusla, not just the fostering service, but other teams within Tusla. Tusla being the National Child Protection Agency within the Republic of Ireland. I did that from 2015 through to 2018, so 4 years. And while on those trips, I would deliver training and sessions for other organisations and in other locations around Ireland. But sadly, I haven't been back since. There was a big disruption in the world over a few years and that limited travel opportunities. But I hope to get back there, if not later this year, but next year.
Okay.
And the UK, of course.
Yeah. So do you come and work over in the UK as well?
I've been largely a tourist. The main work that I have done historically in the UK was in Northern Ireland, so just over the border, where I would, each year when I came over, I delivered training to a disability charities staff and latterly their parents of children involved in the service. And currently I supervise online 2 responsible individuals, nominated individuals. Can't remember which of the 2. I've seen both. You would perhaps know what I mean by that, but they are the 2 directors of leaving care residential facilities or transition from care in the north of England.
Yeah, so responsible individuals. That's right. So I know you've written lots of books and lots of programs, and we're going to talk about that, but I just wonder, how did you get into this work? Were you always interested in it? Did you fall into it? What happened?
I think it was a mixture of both. When I was growing up, I grew up in a family where service to others was really just part of life. I was very much involved in the Anglican Church or Church of England there, but Anglican Church here, growing up, and in youth ministry, and held leadership positions in there. I thought of myself as probably working primarily with teens because that was where I mostly had leadership roles within the church. And I had an uncle who was a clinical psychologist, and he was the youngest of all my uncles and aunts or relatives, being 16 years older than me, but still relatively youthful. And he was a favourite of mine, and I'm probably speaking for my sisters, but I think they'd agree, but he was the favourite uncle. And he was a clinical psychologist, so I had that interest there. So to become a clinical psychologist, you had to do an ordinary degree, an honours degree, and a master's degree. So between my honours degree and master's degree, I had a couple of years away. There was a gap between the honours and the master's. And I started working in child and adolescent mental health research for the local CAMHS. I think CAMHS is an acronym that's known not only here, but also in the UK. So I was a researcher for the director there, and he was very much interested in teen suicide. And it was in that context that I became more, I guess, exposed to the role of family connectedness and family relationships and the impact of that on mental health and suicidality. And was also, I really should look this up again. It's been so long, and I have been asked on other podcasts. But Emile Durkheim, great philosopher and sociologist, wrote a book called Suicide. I think it was published in the 1890s. He had a construct that I probably butcher, referring to it, I recall it as being anomie or something like that. But anyway, the construct was intended to refer to social connectedness. And it was his thesis that people who have low social connectedness or are at greater risk of engaging in suicidal behaviour. So that in turn led me to be quite interested in attachment and attachment theory. And then it went on from there. And it was by accident or design. After I'd finished my master's degree, we travelled for a while, my wife and I, and when we came back, psychologist positions were very difficult to get at that time here. And I was a young male. Maybe people didn't want to take much of a chance on me. So I ended up getting my first job in our most disadvantaged community, working for the local Child Protection Authority. And I've never really left that community. I've left it physically, but I've brought the clients with me.
Yeah.
When I've done that. But on and off over the last 30 years, I have been back in and working in that community. So yeah, that's, I guess, how I don't know if you call that a brief version or a longer version. There's a much longer version, I can tell you that.
No, that's great. I think what I've learned interviewing people is that lots of people, although it feels like they fall into this work, there's actually quite a part of their childhood or teens leads them to this. It's almost like a vocation in some ways, that there's something present that wants people to connect and be part of, even if you don't know this is where I'm going to be.
I certainly believe, that would be my observation as well. And there was research done at one stage. I can't quote who the researchers were, but I remember it being talked about when I was studying, that looked into the background of people who entered the helping professions and typically found that people who had been thrust in a role of looking after others from an earlier age were more represented in those who enter the helping professions. And as I said, I took on leadership roles. I always felt that was something that I needed to do. And I developed a lot as a person. It was really a good thing for me growing up that I had those opportunities, because there were some vexed relationships growing up and not very pleasant relational experiences growing up. So they often say, be the adult that you wished you had in your life growing up. And that's something that I really hold an awareness of every day. And so, yeah, I think that it's that relief of suffering for children and young people that is a major motivating or driving factor in my ongoing work in this area after 30 years, having my beard turn white and my hair fall out, nonetheless.
Yeah, and I think you're talking about that connectedness, and that the guy who was doing the research really right back in the 1800s, that they were saying actually lack of connection really impacts our mental health, and the more positive connections you have, the greater that is. And I wonder if even at a young age, plays part of that being able to connect through play, whether that be sport or in the church groups and things like that. I imagine that you did community activities together, and that builds that connectiveness. Yeah.
There's no doubt that, notwithstanding that the adversities that were present in my life growing up, those involvements that I had in the church, and I've written about this, I think, in the book about resilience. But yes, those roles provided an important buffer for the other less good experiences growing up.
And you've written several books, haven't you? I know the one that I use quite often and recommend and will purchase and give to families that I'm working with is An Introduction to Attachment.
Yeah.
And they're quite, for me, they are very easily digested, understood, but very comprehensive, really. It gives you a really good overview. You've done one on resilience. So you've written quite a few books, Colby.
They're the two. The attachment book has gone to 2 editions, and I always encourage people to purchase and read the second edition. There are things that people loved about the first edition that I did not. So I tried to get a lot of that out, but the publisher wouldn't let me. But the second edition was less an update and probably more a rewrite from my perspective. Yeah, and I've written a few periodical articles as well. Back in the day, I used to to publish more regularly in that regard. Yeah, but probably in the last 10 years or so, most of my writing has been either through just blogs. More recently, I write and then speak to what I write in videos that go on YouTube, but programs is where I devote much of my writing time now.
So can you explain a bit about what your programs are? Because you said you do one over in Ireland, so tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that occurred to me quite a long time ago is that training that is offered and delivered, I've been around for a long time, since there was very little training that was offered, or very little good training. But my observation very early on was training tended to focus a lot on what people needed to know and less so on what people needed to do. It was in that context that I began to first write and then write programs about not only what people needed to know, but also about what I thought people needed to do. I spent a lot of time reflecting on what I was learning about the role that I was, or roles that I was performing. At the beginning, I thought attachment was really important, and I read a lot about attachment, and kind of the thing that I think is really important about attachment is how it influences the way in which children and young people, and in turn adults, approach life and relationships, and how attachment relationships and attachment style, and I've got some perhaps different perspectives about those two things, but how they impact the way in which a child or young person approaches life and relationships. So attachment theory was very much my first theoretical orientation to the work that I did.
Colby, just for people that maybe aren't in our profession and don't really understand what we mean by attachment theory, could you just give a really brief? So if a parent was listening to this and they were thinking, what do you mean in attachment theory? What would you say to a parent who's listening?
Yeah, so attachment refers to the dependency relationship that an infant, child, young person develops towards their primary caregiver in the first instance, and towards other adults who are consistent, recurrent figures in their life. And it is thought to have stemmed from an innate survival instinct in our species. Not just our species, we see it in other species across the animal kingdom, where the young orient to an adult who is better able to cope with and manage the challenges and dangers of the world. We form attachments through the lifespan. We form attachments in our adult life to our life partners. But at its core, attachment relates to that relationship that we develop with someone who helps us through life. Mm. And infants and children form attachments. They form multiple attachments. They form attachments to their primary caregivers, usually mum and dad. Not always. In some places have different parenting customs to what we do in white Western countries, but they form attachments to their main caregivers and caretakers, and they tend to be referred to as primary attachment relationships, and they're seen as being the most influential over a child's attachment style. But we also know that children and young people form lots of attachment, or they are capable of forming lots of attachment relationships, and they can differ. So attachment, there are classifications that have been developed through observation of children relating with adults. So there's different types of attachment style that have been noted. Probably the longest lasting and most used is secure attachment, insecure avoidant, insecure ambivalent, and disorganized. Now, children can form one of those types of attachments to each adult who has continuity and consistency in their life. So it could be their parents, grandparents as well, aunts and uncles, childcare workers, and so on. But the type of attachment they develop to each of those individuals is heavily influenced by their experience of that relationship. So children and young people can have a secure attachment to an adult and a insecure avoidant attachment to another adult, and so on. And ultimately their attachment style is representative of all of those attachment relationships. So you mentioned earlier, you referred to children having lots of attachment relationships, and the reality is that they can have more or less, and the way in which they approach life and relationships is very much influenced by all of those experiences. So attachment, you can have a secure attachment. You can also have a secure attachment style if enough of your if enough of your attachments are secure ones. You can still be secure if you have several secure attachments and maybe an avoidant one to someone, because often parents are not always on the same page when they're parenting children. But overall attachment security, where there's a mix, is probably, you've got to think about attachment as a spectrum with secure at one end and problematic, disordered at the other. And a young person sits where we sit, not just as children and young people, but into our adult life as well. Where we sit on that continuum is a reflection of all our attachment experiences.
And I was going to say, and for children and young people, it's like making a blueprint of what relationships are like. Is that it? So they might have 7 relationships, and 4 of them give them this consistent and nurturing one. One of them gives it sometimes, and then maybe sometimes is not able to for whatever reason. And then there might be a couple that maybe are a bit avoidant or a bit more chaotic. But overall, their blueprint says relationships are consistent, predictable, and worth engaging in. I get something from it. And therefore, as they grow, as long as those are continually reinforced in a way, that is where they hold. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the best, as I said, the best way to think about attachment is as a continuum of depth and strength, if you like, and type. And a person who has had a varied history of attachment relationships is you can probably anticipate that they're not going to be necessarily as secure in their attachment as a person who's had primarily good experiences in their dependency relationships with adult. And yeah, that's why I say, and you said it earlier, I think that children can have a number of attachment relationships, and the more they have, the better. More positive experiences they have, the better. Where they're variable, one of the, you were just mentioning about have the expectations, the blueprint. If children if there's any uncertainty based on mum's like this, dad's like that, and granny's like that, and at childcare, they're not well staffed, and I sit in the corner left to my own device a lot of time. But if in those circumstances, uncertainty creeps in.
Wow.
I think we're programmed to make certainties as much as we can. A certainty can be, it's difficult to predict how adults are going to be.
Yeah.
That's a problematic scenario. And it really very much underpins why, getting back to your question before, why it's important to develop training packages for places like foster care and kinship care and other training packages that I've developed in that space, because consistency of relational experience is really important. There's a construct referred to as primary task, and I used to be able to remember the name starts with a G, used to be able to remember the name of the fellow who first wrote about it. But anyway, your primary task is that most important thing that you do upon which all else sits. Consistency, I think, is close to being the primary task that we have in caring for children, but it probably isn't. I think that our primary task is connection, but consistency runs a very close second. So what happened, just jumping back again to Where children have any uncertainty, they'll test that up. And sadly, what tends to happen is that the negative gets confirmed more than the positive. Inconsistency of relational experience is a big problem, because when children try to reconcile those differences, they more often than not will be confirming the negative.
Yeah.
The adults can't always be relied upon.
Yeah.
You need to steer clear of them, or control, or exert some coercive controlling behaviours towards them to ensure that your needs are met.
And that's what I was going to say. It's about needs, isn't it? When we're talking about attachment, we're talking about those things that keep us alive. Because when we're babies, when we're toddlers, we can't do that for ourselves. So we're talking about food, connection, shelter, warmth, that regulation of being hot and cold, being hungry and thirsty, that we actually rely on another human being, which is our adult, to meet those very primary needs. And what we want in a positive attachment relationship is that they are met predictably, consistently, with connection. So that's when a baby's being fed, they're being held, they're being looked at, they're being talked to, and rather than sometimes they're fed and sometimes they're not, sometimes they're smiled at, sometimes they're not. And that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about whether they get a PlayStation or whether they get the newest rattle. It's this very basic, this is what keeps me alive.
Yeah, that's right. Attachment, as I said, was the primary theoretical orientation. I then, probably in the late 90s, was influenced by the early work of Bruce Perry, but I haven't gone down that path as much as others do. I've really stuck to central nervous system arousal or level of activation, and the relationship between that and attachment and anxiety proneness, which then anxiety proneness then translates into behaviours of concern associated with the fight, flight, freeze response. But just picking up what you said about needs, and Bowlby was the founder, the father of attachment. He was a psychiatrist who back in the 1930s started to think about, write about, talk about these relationships, these important relationships that he was observing children, young children to have towards their primary caregivers. And he worked in a facility for young people who were very problematic in their behaviours in the community, and he was reflecting on the impact of not having enough of those sorts of experiences. Now, the thing I would say about Bowlby also is that he didn't confine himself to the contemporary psychoanalytic thinking of the time to understand what he was observing in children's relationships, including the impact of those forced separations of children from parents during the Blitz, where children were sent out to live in the country away from their parents who were in the big cities in London.
So this is John Bowlby, isn't it? And Mary, they did those.
Mary Ainsworth. Mary Ainsworth. And so John was very much, he was someone who drew knowledge from various areas. He didn't just confine himself. And so I found, and people find this somewhat perplexing, but one of the things that, getting back to needs provision and the regularity and consistency of that, there's a lot to be learned from behaviourist knowledge in that area and the impact of inconsistent reinforcement schedules on behaviours. For example, I was working with intercountry adoption, or in the intercountry adoption area, for a number of years, and I was noticing the children who are coming out of orphanages in third world countries into quite an enriched family and care environment, and they were still behaving for a long time as if they were still in a inconsistently responding environment. And so I was thinking, what explains that? And sure enough, the work of Skinner and the work on reinforcement schedules is actually very helpful to understand that, because a lot of people are focused on the rats and the pigeons in Skinner's experiments that are on a consistent reinforcement schedule. And well, they learn, and how, for example, if you stop feeding them for pressing a lever or a bar, they'll soon stop the behaviour. And this has had big implications confirmatory implications for conventional behaviour management. But less attention has been paid to the animals in his experiments that were on inconsistent reinforcement schedules.
Oh.
Now, why they're interesting to me is because that describes the kids I work with. They haven't been raised by wolves. They haven't had no care. I've yet to meet a child who's had no care in the problematic care environment from which they were placed away. Yeah. The main issue was that sometimes they did and sometimes they didn't get care. And what Skinner's work, if you look at that particular group, shows is that where there is an inconsistent responsiveness, that learning is slow, that you can rely on this behaviour to get your needs met. But once you have a sense that you can get it, sometimes you go at it like a bull at a gate. You keep going and going and going, even though you don't always get a response. You just keep going until you think you can. And now this is endemic to the experience of adoptive parents, foster parents, kinship carers. When I've done I did a big survey of them a few years ago. It confirmed what I suspected would be the case, which is the biggest behavioural challenge that they have is how demanding the children are. And this is, I think, very well understood in terms of operant conditioning. So anyway, to get back to your earlier question, I had all these insights and knowledge. I wrote about them. I wrote about them as a model, the AAA model, attachment, arousal, accessibility to needs provision is what I refer to as the operant stuff, and wrote about that in my first edition of the attachment book, a subsequent paper after that, and then brought that all together into a package called the AAA model of therapeutic care. We probably don't have time to talk about all of that. And the AAA is what they've been implementing in Ireland for the last 10 years. But going back to the point I made about consistency and primary tasks, consistency, as I said, it's a toss-up between consistency and connection. It's connection because connection will always win over. As an organism, we function best in consistent environments. We can also function reasonably well in a consistently bad environment. So our primary task is not just to provide a consistent environment. It's to provide a consistently good environment where there's connection and where there's other things that I'm interested in.
And I suppose, can I just, because that's one of the things that often when I'm working with families who are then caring for children who've come from tricky backgrounds and had a harder time, is that they feel like they're drawn back into the arguments or that their household is becoming something they don't want it to be. And I think just linking to what you're saying there is that children find a way to survive in a home that provides consistency. And that consistency, hopefully, is caring, nurturing, predictable, and they're getting all their needs met. But it can be consistent and predictable in aggression and violence and neglect. And they find a way, again, when you talked about the nervous system and things, they find a way to survive in that, don't they? And actually, that in itself is the consistent safety. So when you're then in a household that is providing the opposite almost, it can feel unsafe because they actually don't have the skills to survive. Is that right?
That's right. So it can feel to the young people more threatening. Relationship and relational connection is, I think, the primary trigger. And I wrote about this in one of my periodical articles some years ago. Relationships are the primary trigger. So people get very focused on the behaviours of our young people, and we oftentimes want them to look beyond the behaviour to what is going on for the child, and we want them to respond therapeutically to the reasons for those behaviours. And somewhere in the middle there, people get interested on what has triggered the behaviour. And I would say that on a great many occasions, you'll find that it was relational closeness that was the trigger. And many of the other triggers are very difficult to discern what set the children off. But you're right that there are certain environments that feel more familiar and more survivable And they're not the kinds of environments that we would want the children to grow up in independence.
And when you
Yeah.
say relational closeness, do you mean that they've come from maybe a place where the attachment figure hasn't been as present as you'd want them to be, and then they are then living with adults that want that closeness, but actually it can feel scary or unfamiliar or odd, so they push away against that connective relationship?
Yeah. So suffocating, where it's just been that they've not had an adult particularly attentive and responsive to them. But for many of our children who display quite disordered attachment behaviour, the reality is that the adults have been inattentive and or overly or triggered by the child's attempts to get comfort, and usually that they have been a source of fear and distress and hurt. And so you can imagine if a child's been hurt, deeply hurt in those first dependency relationships, they're going to find relational connection quite triggering. Again, drawing on a tradition outside of perhaps attachment theory proper, so to speak, I think about the experience of the child in those circumstances where relational connection is the trigger for them. And I think that's most of our children who've experienced abuse and neglect. They have a phobia of it. It's a phobia. And the most evidence-based treatment of phobias is exposure. So what we want to do is actually expose them to relational connection as much as possible. But we want to do it in such a way that it is low dose, that it kind of sneaks in under their guard, under their defences. The only place where it's not low dose, I think, is in therapy. Therapy is at least the therapy that I do is a very high dose of relational connection. Play is one of those play is probably the best way, in my view, to expose the child to relational connection without them defending against that connection. Yeah, I would have, so just to finish off on those different packages and consistency, so I've got different packages for the home, for school, for professionals, including how you do therapy with these children and young people, how you help caregivers as a professional, how you help caregivers of these children and young people. And much of what I talk about is about how you respond to needs, how you acknowledge the experience, and how you interact with the child with interest, how you be present with the child. And those things translate you can see those important things in play.
Yeah.
So therapy is very playful, so to speak. But my ultimate goal in my writing is to, as much as possible, facilitate a consistent relational experience between the home, school, and the therapist consulting room. Consistent exposure, low grade, except for when they're interacting with me, low intensity, or what's the word I used and I'm looking for again, it's gone from my head, low dose exposure.
Julie and I often talk about play doesn't have to be an intense 30 minutes piece of we're going to get out the Lego or the Barbies and we're going to sit and play. And it can be 2 minutes of blowing the bubbles out of the sink, or a quick game of Thumb Wars, or a kickabout in the garden, or I guess where you guys are, a run on the beach and a build in a sandcastle. And those few moments where we're completely regulated, we're in our whole brain, is going to often provide for children where relationships are more scary, those moments of regulated connection is going to just keep building. I think about it. Somebody once said to me, it's like throwing pebbles in a pond and you can't see the pebbles until one day you've thrown that many in. they start to peek out the top, but you've got to throw a lot in. And those 2 minutes, 5 minutes connections are like those pebbles, aren't they, going in?
That's a fantastic metaphor for what it is. I do a similar sort of task in my training, but at the same point is, and I would apply this to all families, and this is what parenting is all about, the growing environment that you put into place. And we have certain instincts, but also if we have a mind and we have experiences, and if we have a mind too, we can have a look at what guidance is out there. But the guidance is about the environment that we provide. And it's a bit like being a farmer. Like, you can put the fences around the field, you can turn over the soil, you can fertilize. You can't do anything necessarily about locusts or things of that nature. But the farmer then seeds and then waits. And can't control the weather either, but just waits to see what happens. But the better the growing environment, you'd think the better the outcome. And that probably holds true to a greater or lesser extent, because there are still things that you can't control. Other things, that, as I said, the weather or a plague of locusts or the like. But play is a critical aspect of that growing environment. Not least because of what I said before, is that children's guard is often down in those circumstances and they'll accept relational connection. But when we're playing with the children, and I use acronyms a lot in my care, care is one of them, in my training packages, but an acronym that I like to use these days is AURA. And aura, not the new age kind of definition of aura, although that's why I use it, because I'm a little bit mischievous. But aura, in the sense that felt quality of a person or a place, a person's experience, their aura, the aura of this place, the aura of this person. And what we want in conventional nurturing care environments, and what we want enriched, not in a high dose way, but enriched in where a child or young person is recovering from a tough start to life, is we want them to experience that adults are accessible. They can be depended on in that way. The adults do understand what your needs are. They will respond to them in their words, in their actions, and in their expressed emotions. And the adults are attuned to your emotional experience. Accessible, understanding, responsive, and attuned. That's the AURA acronym. That's what we want children to experience that. And that's what happens in play. In play, we are accessible. We're there for the child for as little as 5 minutes a day. There is various indications in the research literature that as little, I think it's parent-child interaction therapy prescribes 5 minutes of play a day as homework. And that's a separate, longer conversation about where that advice comes from. But yes, as you say, it doesn't need to be hours and hours. It can be moments and moments. But in those moments, the child experiences you ideally as present and accessible, because you naturally fall into sync with each other during play. So the child feels that you experiencing what I'm experiencing, you get me, you understand me, you're truly here with me. In play, and the children need that. All children need that. So that meets some very important needs for them. That connection that we have with them in play reassures them that they can depend on us, that they can depend on us to understand their experience and respond to it, that they can depend on us to understand their emotions and respond to their emotions. And in turn, they experience themselves as a person of worth, as being acceptable, as being capable, because Colby's terrible at games. Colby always loses. I do always lose at the start. I often say, the children I work with, adults will say, why do you let them win all the time? And I said, they need to learn how to be a winner before they can learn how to be a loser.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think it's an art, Colby, to lose Uno and Jenga every time.
Yeah.
And when you've got the winning hand and you just want to win, and then you have to lose, don't you? Do you know what I mean? Or Jenga, it's an art in itself, I think, to lose so consistently.
Yeah, the funniest story is one where I used to play balloon volleyball quite regularly with pretty much all the children that I saw or that I see. And I'm getting a bit too old for that now, but although I'm not really, I could do it. But anyway, I had one young person who'd been coming along to see me for a number of years, and balloon volleyball was just their favourite thing to do. And they turned to their foster. This was, I don't know, it was a significant moment, but we're in the reception. It might have been just before they turned 18 and were aging out of care as such. They turned to their mum. We were having a conversation about the years of involvement, and they said, yeah, and balloon volleyball. Thank you, Colby, for hyping her up before she came back and running, which I wasn't trying to do, but anyway. And the balloon volleyball's always been a big hit. And she said, yeah, and I always won.
Oh.
And I said, and what was the score? She needed to feel like a winner. The score was always 15-14. Always.
Was it?
Always. For years.
Yeah. And it's so nice to do. And I think that's the conversation therapy I do is therapy. So we lose a lot at things like thumb wars and cotton ball hockey and all those sorts of things. And often the conversation that I'll have with parents is it's not the winning or losing, it's the connection. It's the moment of joy that you can have in celebrating the win with your child. It's not the losing, and that joy that they can feel that you have in them is priceless, isn't it? When you'd lose a million times, and to see that little smile or that connection, and that's what we want them to have, isn't it?
Yeah, so trust in adults, but also they need to leave. We need them to feel like winners, because winners will explore the world with less anxiety. And exploration is the key ingredient for realizing your potential, developmental potential. If they leave us, leave home, leave the therapy room feeling like winners, then they'll be more persistent in their endeavors at school, for example. Yeah. I used to do a lot of observations of parent-child interactions in the child protection context, and just seeing the looks on children's face when they're crushed in a game by their parents, because their parents are they just haven't had it explained to them, haven't fully understood that you need to win. That's what we do with little ones, isn't it? We wouldn't crush a very young child in an activity, make them feel small and bad. We build them up. 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 And when they're confident in themselves and their abilities, then we might make things a little bit harder for them and a little bit harder for them. Yeah.
I think they get to that themselves, don't they? I just think if we're generous with our children, we're modeling generosity, and that is about winning, that is about sharing, that is about time. But if we can be generous with our children, then we model that this is what relationships are like. And then what I see, even in therapy, is I play tug of war and I always fall over and they always win. And then slowly, over time, I see them whisper to their parent, let Philippa win this time. Let them.
Yes.
And they then let me win. Fall over, and I'll rejoice in winning, and then I'll say, I think you let me win then, didn't you? But it's that generosity of spirit, isn't it? That if we are generous, then they can be generous back.
So that comes back as well to what we were saying earlier about needs, is when our cup is full, we can be generous. When we're not worried about how full our cup is, when we're not worried about accessibility to needs provision, we can be generous. Yeah.
So just a very last question, because we're coming to the end. I could ask you a million more, but I suppose it's just that ending on hope, really, that children and families that have maybe started with tricky times, that have had a harder life, and their attachments maybe have been quite hard and insecure, with consistent, predictable care, do you think that, I'm hoping the answer is yes, Colby, but that when we pour all this in, it creates change, so that as they go into adulthood, as they go into their own adult relationships and their own relationships with their own children, that we can make that difference?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Your question, is it recoverable? It is. I think there are certain things that speed up the process or not in the absence of those things. And I think ultimately some of the things that do speed up the process is having everyone singing from the same hymn sheet, basically. School, home, therapist room. As I said, I've had programs to try and facilitate that consistency. But I also think a lot about the One Good Adult research. So the One Good Adult research was the research that showed that as long as a child or young person has had someone in their life, an adult, who is there, who they can rely on to be there for them, to understand them and to respond to them in tough times, that they are less likely to experience mental health issues, addiction and other behavioural issues, and suicidal behaviour. And there's various research around that shows that distinction. And I think that that works where you're looking at large populations. I think having at least one good adult in the life of our children and young people is a good thing, but it's the slow path. It's the slow path to change. The quicker path to recovery is having a number of good adults in their life.
Yeah. So that's fantastic. Chloe, thank you very much. So your programs, you've got a website, so if I put a link in the description of this episode, people who want to find out more from your books or your programs, they can just go onto your website and they'll be able to access all the information they need from there.
Yeah, the Secure Start, that way. Secure Start website.
The Secure Start website. Yeah, I'll put a link in the bio. So thank you so much for being a guest on our podcast. And if people have enjoyed this podcast, please hit subscribe and thank you very much, Colby.
You're welcome.